Warning: this story contains extreme violence, slasher elements, and murder. I encourage you to listen to the entire story, and if you enjoy this type of content, please subscribe and press the bell icon to stay updated. The castle loomed on the horizon, its jagged spires slicing through the stormy night sky like fangs. Julian Blackwood, the last heir to the Blackwood legacy, had returned to claim his birthright. He rode through the iron gates, his eyes tracing the darkened halls that had haunted his dreams for years. His father had spoken little of the family's history, only cryptic warnings about a forbidden pact sealed centuries ago, a pact with Dracula. As Julian crossed the threshold of the grand foyer, the air grew heavier, as if the walls themselves whispered his name. A fire flickered in the great hearth, though no servants were in sight. The castle was eerily silent, save for the distant rhythmic sound of dripping water. Yet Julian felt a presence. It tugged at him, drawing him deeper into the heart of the ancient fortress. He found himself before a portrait, an ancestor, Lord Edgar Blackwood, with eyes burning like embers, standing beside a shadowed figure. The figure's face was hidden, but Julian knew instinctively who it was. Dracula. Julian's pulse quickened as he continued to explore the halls, a strange sensation unfurling inside him. It was more than fear, it was desire. He could feel it, deep within his bones, a magnetic pull towards something. No, someone. The whispers grew louder, beckoning him into the dungeon beneath the castle, where ancient stone steps spiraled downward into darkness. At the bottom, the air was thick with decay, and yet there was an intoxicating allure to it. A chamber opened before him, lit by pale moonlight filtering through a single, broken window. And there, standing at the center, was a figure cloaked in shadows, tall and elegant, with eyes that shimmered like molten silver. Julian Blackwood, the voice purred, soft as silk and dark as night. "Welcome home." Dracula stepped forward, his pale skin glowing in the dim light, a smile caught in his throat as the vampire's eyes bore into his, as if unraveling the very core of his soul. The centuries-old pact pulsed in the air between them, and Julian could feel it, an ancient, unbreakable bond that had been waiting for him all along. "You are your father's son," Dracula whispered, circling him slowly, his voice laced with seduction. "And yet, you are different. You crave more than just power. You crave something darker." Julian tried to speak, but the words died on his lips as Dracula's hand brushed against his chest, sending a wave of heat through his body. His skin prickled with anticipation, and his thoughts blurred, overtaken by a primal, consuming desire. He could feel the weight of the centuries pressing down on him, the blood of his ancestors singing in his veins, demanding he fulfill the pact. "You feel it, don't you?" Dracula's breath was hot against his ear. The power. The pleasure. The eternal night. Julian shuddered, his mind torn between the lust for power and the fear of what he was becoming. His father had warned him of this, of Dracula's seduction, of the promise of eternal pleasure that came with the bite. But in that moment, all Julian could think of was the overwhelming desire that coursed through him. The vampire's touch was electric, a siren call he could no longer resist. "Give yourself to me," Dracula murmured, his lips grazing Julian's neck. "And I will give you everything your heart desires. Power. Pleasure. Immortality." Julian's resolve crumbled. He could feel his humanity slipping away, piece by piece, as Dracula's fangs grazed his skin. There was no turning back now. The pact had been sealed centuries ago, and now it was his turn to pay the price. With a low, guttural growl, Dracula sank his fangs into Julian's neck. Pain and ecstasy collided in a blinding rush, and Julian gasped, his body trembling as mingled with Dracula's, and in that moment, he felt the full weight of the pact, a pact not just for power, but for eternal submission. the room spun around him, and as the last vestiges of his humanity faded, Julian understood the truth. The power he had sought was nothing compared to the eternal pleasure Dracula promised. But it came at a cost far greater than he had ever imagined. As Dracula withdrew, his lips stained with Julian's blood, he smiled. "Welcome to eternity, my prince." Julian collapsed to his knees, his body trembling with the raw power that now coursed through him. But with that power came an overwhelming darkness, an eternal night that he could never escape. Dracula had seduced him into a world of erotic submission, where pleasure and pain were one and the same. And as the castle walls closed in around him, Julian knew that he was bound to Dracula for all time, his soul lost to the Forbidden Blood Pact. Julian's vision blurred as he collapsed into Dracula's arms, his body burning with a mixture of pain and pleasure so overwhelming it threatened to shatter him. The vampire held him close, his grip firm but sensually possessive, as though Julian were a precious relic claimed after centuries of waiting. His pulse throbbed where the bite still oozed with Dracula's dark gift, a constant reminder of the pact now coursing through his veins. As he struggled to regain his breath, Dracula's voice, low and commanding, washed over him. "You are mine now, Julian. Your body, your soul, they belong to me." The words, uttered with a mix of erotic intensity and sinister authority, sent a fresh wave of desire through Julian. He looked up into Dracula's eyes, those silvery orbs brimming with dark promise. The shadows in the dungeon seemed to pulse and writhe, as if responding to their master's unspoken will. Julian could no longer deny the truth. He was bound not just by blood, but by a desire so primal, so carnal, that it can. Dracula's hand slid down Julian's chest, lingering over the spot where his heart beat faster than it ever had before. His touch was cold, but it ignited a fire in Julian that spread through his limbs, each nerve alive with want. The vampire leaned closer, his lips brushing against Julian's ear, his breath sending shivers down his spine. "Do you feel it?" Dracula whispered, his voice barely audible but thick with lust. "The hunger inside you, it will only grow. Soon, you will crave more than just power." Julian's head lolled back, his body responding instinctively to the vampire's touch. His skin tingled as Dracula's fingers moved lower, teasing, drawing out the torment of his transformation. He could no longer think, reason had been replaced by sensation, and all he wanted was to submit, to surrender to the dark pleasure Dracula offered. Dracula's lips found his again, this time more forceful, claiming him with an intensity that left no room for doubt. The kiss was not just erotic, it was possessive, a mark of dominance that thrilled Julian to his core. He moaned against the vampire's mouth, his body arching into Dracula's as the heat between them grew unbearable. "You crave me, don't you?" Dracula murmured, pulling back just enough to let their gazes meet. His eyes burned with a mixture of lust and amusement, knowing exactly what Julian was feeling. Julian could only nod. His voice lost in the whirlwind of sensation. The weight of the pact, the bite, the seductive pull of Dracula's presence, it was all too much. He was drowning in it, and yet, he didn't want to escape. Every part of him longed to sink deeper into the abyss Dracula offered. Satisfied, Dracula let out a low, rumbling laugh that echoed through the dungeon's stone walls. "Good," he purred, his hand now sliding to Julian's waist, pulling him closer. "You are learning. But this is only the beginning, my prince. Soon, you will understand the full extent of motion." Dracula lifted Julian from the cold stone floor and carried him deeper into the shadows. The castle seemed to pulse with their movement, as though it was alive, a part of the dark magic that bound them. Julian's head swam with delirium as Dracula laid him gently upon a grand, ancient bed draped in crimson velvet. The room was opulent, filled with relics from eras long past, but there was something chilling about it, a sense of decay hidden beneath the luxury. Dracula loomed above him, his silhouette framed by flickering candlelight. His features were impossibly beautiful, yet terrifying, a creature crafted to inspire both lust and fear. Julian's breath hitched as Dracula undid the buttons of his shirt, slowly revealing his pale, muscular chest. Each motion was deliberate, as if to prolong Julian's anticipation, drawing him deeper into the seductive nightmare. "You have been touched by the darkness," Dracula whispered, his fingers now trailing across Julian's bare skin, sending jolts of electric pleasure through him. "And soon, you will be one with it." Julian's body quivered under the vampire's touch, his senses overwhelmed. Every inch of him burned with a hunger he had never known, a need that only Dracula could satisfy. He reached up, desperate to pull Dracula closer, to feel the cold yet searing embrace that had become his obsession. But Dracula, ever the master of control, moved just out of reach, his lips curling into a wicked smile. "Patience, my dear Julian," he said, his voice thick with amusement. "The night is young, and there is much to explore." With a fluid grace, Dracula stripped away the last of Julian's clothes, leaving him exposed, vulnerable, yet yearning for more. Julian's heart raced as the vampire lowered himself, his lips grazing the sensitive skin of his throat, his fangs barely brushing the surface. The anticipation was maddening, every touch sending Julian spiraling deeper. When reached its breaking point, Dracula's fangs pierced his flesh once more. This time, the pain was sweeter, more intense, as the vampire drank deeply from his neck. Julian's moans filled the chamber, a mixture of pleasure and agony as his blood flowed into Dracula's mouth. Each pulse of his heart seemed to tie him more tightly to the vampire, to the darkness that now owned him. As Dracula drank, his other hand explored Julian's body, tracing every curve, every line, with a lover's touch. The sensation was overwhelming, a mixture of pain and pleasure so intense that Julian thought he might explode from it. His body responded with an urgency he had never felt before. A desperate need for Dracula, for the fulfillment of the dark promise they had made. When Dracula finally pulled away, his lips stained with Julian's blood, he looked down at his prey with a mixture of hunger and satisfaction. "You are mine, Julian," he whispered, his voice thick with lust. "And now, we will become one." With that, Dracula moved with predatory grace, claiming Julian fully, body and soul, in an act of dark eroticism that bound them together for eternity. The room filled with the sound of their passion, a mixture of moans, gasps, and the steady rhythm of the ancient blood pact that pulsed between them. As Julian succumbed completely to Dracula's power, he realized the terrible truth: he was no longer the man he had been. He was something more, and something less. Bound to the eternal night, lost in the ecstasy of Dracula's embrace, he had become a part of the darkness, a slave to the Forbidden Blood Pact that would consume him forever. The night stretched endlessly as Julian lay beneath Dracula, his body trembling from the intensity of their union. His skin was marked with the traces of their passion, the bite wounds, and the dark bruises left behind by the vampire's purr was filled with the scent of sweat and blood, mingling with the decaying perfume of centuries past. The shadows seemed to dance around them, as if the castle itself rejoiced in their unholy bond. Dracula lay beside Julian now, his fingers still caressing his skin, leaving trails of cold fire wherever they passed. Julian's chest heaved with shallow breaths, his mind swimming in a haze of pleasure and terror. He had been consumed, body and soul, by the ancient creature who had seduced him so thoroughly. But somewhere in the back of his mind, beneath the cloud of lust and submission, a faint ember of fear still flickered. The full weight of the pact began to settle in his bones. Julian could feel the darkness creeping inside him, an insidious hunger gnawing at his insides, whispering to him of power and submission, pleasure and eternal night. The thrill of immortality, the allure of endless desire, it all tasted so sweet. Yet, it came with a price he hadn't fully grasped. Dracula turned toward him, his silver eyes gleaming in the dim light. His lips curled into a satisfied smile, the very image of power and seduction. "You are exquisite, my prince," he murmured, his voice smooth as velvet. "Every inch of you belongs to me now." Julian shuddered at the words, but a part of him was still captivated, intoxicated by the vampire's presence. His body craved Dracula's touch again. Even though his mind warned him of the darkness that lay ahead, but then something shifted. In the silence that followed, the castle seemed to groan, its old stones creaking under an unseen weight. Julian's senses, heightened by the bite, picked up on a presence, something more ancient, more malevolent than even Dracula. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so swiftly that Julian's breath began to mist in the air. Dracula's eyes flickered, a brief moment of tension crossing his features. It was subtle, but enough for Julian from the bed with a grace that seemed almost inhuman, his gaze narrowing as he stared into the darkness that pooled in the corners of the room. "What is it?" Julian asked, his voice thick with both curiosity and fear. Dracula's expression hardened, and he stepped away from the bed, his long coat billowing behind him as he moved toward the window. "There are forces at play tonight," he murmured, his tone low and dangerous. "Forces that even I do not fully control." Julian sat up, the cold now gnawing at his skin. The sensation was different from the seductive chill of Dracula's touch. This was something darker, more sinister, an ancient presence that seemed to seep through the very stones of the castle. "Is it part of the pact?" Julian asked, his heart quickening. The fear that had lain dormant in his chest now flared to life, growing with each passing second. Dracula remained silent for a moment, his eyes scanning the horizon beyond the window. Then he turned back to Julian, his face unreadable. "The pact is eternal," he said, his voice colder now, stripped of the erotic allure it had carried before. "But it comes with consequences. The hunger you feel now, the power I have granted you, it will only grow. And there are others who hunger for it as well." Julian's stomach tightened. "Others?" Dracula's lips twitched into a cruel smile. "You did not think you were the only one to be seduced by the darkness. Did you? There are many who have sought what you now possess. And not all of them are as patient as I." As if summoned by Dracula's words, the room seemed to shift again. The shadows grew darker, thickening into almost tangible shapes. And from those shadows, a figure emerged, a woman, her face pale and ethereal, her eyes burning with a hunger that mirrored Dracula's but carried a different kind of malice. She was beautiful, in a terrifying way, her dark hair flowing around. Her gaze locked onto Julian, and he felt the weight of her desire hit him like a physical blow. There was something primal in her eyes, a ravenous need that set his pulse racing. Dracula's voice was sharp now, slicing through the tension in the room. "Lilith." The woman, Lilith, smiled, a smile filled with cruelty and lust. "My dear Dracula," she purred, her voice a low, seductive growl. "You didn't think you could keep him all to yourself, did you?" Julian's breath caught in his throat as she approached, her steps slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. He could feel her power, different from Dracula's but just as intoxicating. Her gaze raked over him, sending shivers of both fear and desire down his spine. Dracula stepped forward, placing himself between Julian and Lilith. "He is mine," he growled, his voice laced with a dark warning. Lilith's eyes gleamed with amusement. "Oh, but he is ours, dear Dracula. The pact binds him to the darkness, not just to you." Julian's heart pounded as he realized the full depth of the situation. The pact had bound him to Dracula, but also to something larger, something far more terrifying. The hunger that gnawed at him was not just Dracula's gift. It was the hunger of the darkness itself, a hunger that Lilith, and others like her, would try to claim. Dracula's gaze flicked back to Julian, his expression torn between desire and possessiveness. "Do not listen to her. He commanded. She is a serpent, a deceiver. Lilith's laughter was soft, almost musical, but it carried an edge of malice. You say that, and yet here he is, already longing for more. I can see it in his eyes. He wants the darkness, just as much as it wants him. Julian felt his body react, a flush of heat spreading through him as Lilith's words settled in his mind. She was right, despite the terror, despite the fear, there was a part of him that craved the darkness. The thought of more power, more pleasure, thudded in his ears, louder than the howling wind that battered the ancient castle walls. He was paralyzed between the two beings, Dracula, his master, his seducer, and Lilith, a creature whose hunger was as deep and terrifying as the abyss itself. The air was thick with tension, the scent of blood and desire swirling between them like a tangible force. Dracula's grip tightened around Lilith's neck, his fangs bared in a warning, but Lilith only smiled, her lips parting in a sultry invitation, even as the power of Dracula's hold pressed into her pale skin. Her eyes glowed with wicked amusement, flicking between the vampire lord and Julian, who stood frozen at the foot of the velvet-draped bed. She was not intimidated. If anything, she seemed to revel in the tension, feeding off the deadly energy that filled the room. Julian's body, newly awakened to the lustful hunger that had claimed him, throbbed with conflicting needs. The part of him that still clung to his humanity recoiled from the darkness that had bound him, yet another part, a deeper, primal part, yearned to dive headfirst into it. His eyes locked onto Lilith, her body radiating a strange, predatory beauty. She was the night personified, as alluring as she was dangerous. You see it, don't you? Lilith purred, her voice like honey dripping into his veins. Her eyes never left Julian's. The hunger. You can feel it. Deep inside you. It calls to you, whispers of power, pleasure, eternity. But he, her gaze flicked to Dracula, he has kept you from the true depths of what you are. Dracula's grip remained firm, his jaw clenched as he stared down at Lilith, the ancient tension between them palpable. But Julian could see it now, could feel it, a sliver of doubt creeping into the vampire lord's perfect composure. Enough of your games, Lilith, Dracula growled, his voice cold and unyielding. Lilith's laugh, soft and mocking, echoed in the chamber like the ringing of a death knell. He was never yours alone, my love. You cannot keep him from what he was destined to become. She smiled, her gaze sliding back to Julian, dark and filled with promise. Come to me, Julian. Julian's breath hitched, his body betraying him as he took a half-step toward her, his blood roaring in his ears. There was something in her voice, an irresistible pull, an offer of freedom, of indulgence, that Dracula had never granted him. The vampire lord had taken him, yes, claimed him, made him his own, but Lilith. She promised something more. Something darker. Something dangerous. Julian, no. Dracula's voice cut through the air. Sharp and commanding. His eyes were ablaze with fury and fear, a rare and terrifying combination. Do not listen to her. She seeks only to consume you. Julian's gaze wavered, his heart caught between the pull of both creatures. Dracula's hold over him had been intoxicating, wrapping him in the allure of power and submission. But Lilith. She was offering him something Dracula never had, choice. Freedom to embrace the darkness on his own terms. Do you truly believe you can escape this, Julian? Lilith whispered, her voice slithering into his mind like a seductive poison. You are already part of the night, bound to the blood, bound to us. But with me, you will be more than a pawn in his games. You will be the darkness. Julian's chest tightened. He could feel the hunger gnawing at him, the insidious craving for more power, more pleasure, more of the endless night that had already claimed his soul. He looked at Dracula, his gaze steady now, searching the vampire's eyes for something, anything, that might reassure him. But what he saw in Dracula's gaze was not just desire. It was possession. "You belong to me," Dracula whispered, his voice low, intense, as if willing Julian to remember the promise, bound by blood and by eternity. "Together, we will rule the night." But Julian hesitated. Was that truly what he wanted? To be Dracula's, forever a prince in the shadows, always at his side, but never truly free? Or did he crave something else, something darker, more primal, the raw freedom Lilith offered? He could feel the war inside him, the tug-of-war between Dracula's seductive dominance and Lilith's whispered promises. The power surged within him, a roiling storm of blood and desire, each pull more overwhelming than the last. He was drowning in it, torn between his lust for Dracula and the dangerous allure of Lilith. Lilith's eyes glittered as she watched the conflict play out in his mind. "Make your choice, Julian. Become his plaything, or become something greater than either of us." Dracula's voice turned to a low, dangerous growl. "Do not betray me, Julian." The weight of the moment pressed down on him, suffocating in its intensity. His body ached with need, his mind screaming for release from the torment that bound him. And in the silence that followed, the world seemed to stand still, as if the very castle itself held its breath, waiting for his decision. Julian stepped forward, Lilith's eyes lit with triumph, her lips curling into a seductive smile. But just as she moved toward him, reaching out to claim him, Julian stopped. His gaze flicked to Dracula, his master. His lover, the creature who had given him everything and taken just as much. "No," Julian whispered, his voice hoarse but resolute. "I choose neither." Lilith's smile faltered, confusion flashing across her face. Dracula's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing in fury. "You cannot deny the darkness, Julian," Lilith hissed, her voice sharper now, more desperate. "You are the night." But Julian shook his head, the storm inside him calming as he found the strength he had feared was lost. "I may be bound to the darkness," he said, his voice strong, "will not be its slave." Dracula's fury was palpable, the air crackling with his power. "You fool," he spat, stepping toward him. "You cannot escape me, the pact is eternal," Julian interrupted, his eyes hardening. "But I will not let it define me. Not anymore." For the first time, Dracula hesitated. Julian could see it, the uncertainty, the flicker of something close to doubt. And in that moment, Julian realized the truth. Dracula's power, Lilith's promises, it was all an illusion. He was bound to them, yes, but the true power lay within him. Without another word, Julian turned and walked toward the door of the chamber, his body thrumming with the power of his choice. Lilith's voice echoed behind him. A final, desperate plea. "You cannot run from us, Julian. The darkness will always find you." Julian paused at the threshold, glancing back at the two creatures who had fought to claim him. His heart pounded, his blood still burned with their touch, but he knew now, he was neither Dracula's pawn nor Lilith's plaything. He was something more. "I'm not running," he said quietly, his voice steady. "I'm embracing what I am. But I will do it on my own terms." And with that, he disappeared into the night, leaving behind the seductive, deadly pull of Dracula and Lilith. The castle groaned in protest as the doors slammed shut, and the wind howled once more through its ancient halls, but somewhere deep in the night, the darkness watched.